So today's video is about finding the missing angle. So let's first look at some angle pairs. So this first angle pair is called vertical angles, and vertical angles are formed when you have two intersecting lines, and they are the angles that are directly across from each other. And vertical angles are congruent, meaning they are the same measurement. So we want to find the value of x in each one of these figures. So if I look at this figure here, I have the two intersecting lines, which means that it's forming some vertical angles. And because these two angles are across from each other, that means they are the same measurement. So if this is 60 degrees, that means x is also 60 degrees. The same here, if this is 140 degrees, because these are vertical angles, x is also 140 degrees. Another angle pair are called complementary angles, and complementary angles are angles that add up to equal 90 degrees. So if I look at these two angles here, because 45 and 45 add up to equal 90, these would be called complementary angles. And because 10 and 80 add up to equal 90s, these two angles would be called complementary angles. Supplementary angles are two angles that add up to equal 180 degrees. So if these two angles are added together, 170 and 10, they would give me 180 degrees. Then down here, these two angles would also add up to equal 180 because 120 plus 60 equals 180. So these are all supplementary angles. So now we want to use that information to help us find some missing angles. So if I'm looking at this diagram here, because the two angles together form a straight line, they are supplementary angles. And if they're supplementary angles, that means they have to add up to equal 180 degrees. So if I want to know what the angle of what's the measure of angle x, all I simply have to do is do 180 minus 120, which means that angle x would have to be equal to 60 degrees. So here I have another set of supplementary angles. They form a straight line, and that means they have to add up to equal 180 degrees. So if this angle here is 80, to find my missing angle, I'm going to do 180 minus 80, which means that angle x has to be equal to 100 degrees. Then down here, again, I have two supplementary angles. They add up to equal 180 degrees. So if this angle here is 40, if I want to know what angle x is, I'm going to do 180 minus 40, which means that angle x would have to be 140 degrees. Now, here we have a pair of complementary angles. These actually form a right angle, and that means they should add up to equal 90 degrees. So if this angle here is 20, if I want to know the value of angle x, I'll do 90 minus 20, which means that angle x has to be 70 degrees. So here again, these are forming a right angle, which means they are complementary angles. And if this angle here is 70 degrees, to find angle x, I'm going to do 90 minus 70, which means that angle x would be 20 degrees. Then down here, if this angle here is 50 and these two angles together form a 90 degree angle, to find angle x, I'm going to do 90 minus 50, which means that angle x has to be 40 degrees. Now a triangle, the inside of a triangle, all of those angles have to add up to equal 180 degrees. And there are three angles inside of a triangle. So I can use that information again to help me find a missing angle. So here I have this diagram, and they've given me this angle here, which is 35 degrees, and they've given me this angle down here, which is 90 degrees, and they want me to find the value of x. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to set up this equation. I know that the three angles together have to add up to equal 180 degrees. So I know that the 35 degree angle, the 90 degree angle, and x have to add to equal 180. So the first thing I'll do is I'll add the 35 and the 90, which gives me 125. So now my equation is 125 plus x equals 180. Now I'm going to solve my equation and figure out what my missing number is. So I'm going to subtract 125 from both sides of the equation. These cancel, which leaves me that x is 55 degrees. So now I know that x has to be equal to 55 degrees. So now I have a little bit more complicated diagram, which is going to kind of take a couple of those different angle pairs and all kind of put them together. So you kind of have to be like a detective. To try to find your missing angle, you're going to have to look at the clues that you've already been given, and we're going to have to use that to help us find other angles. And then sometimes we're going to have to find several angles before we can get to the ones that we really want to know. So as I look at this diagram, I first want to try to figure out, or I actually want to look at the diagram as a whole picture. So I see I have a straight line here, I see that I have a 90-degree angle here, and I see that I have this triangle. That all gives me information. I know that this angle here is 90 degrees. I know that this angle here is 125 degrees. All of that is information I can use to help me figure out what angle X and angle Y is. So now what I want to figure out is which one of these angles can I figure out first, because I can't figure them out at the same time. So as I look at my diagram, there's really nothing around Y that's going to help me figure out what Y is. So I probably am not going to be able to figure that one out first. So now I'm going to look down here at X and see if there's anything around X that I can use to help me find what the measure of X is. So as I look at my diagram, I see that, well, this angle here, that's 125 degrees, and X, they're actually supplementary angles. Together they form a straight line. That means they have to add up to equal 180 degrees. So because they're supplementary angles and I know they have to add up to equal 180, I'm going to do 180 minus 125, which means that angle X must be 55 degrees. So what I've just figured out is that angle X is equal to 55 degrees. Now that I know that X is 55 degrees, I can now use that information to help me find Y. And the one thing that I can see from my diagram is that X and Y are inside of a triangle. If they're inside of a triangle, that means together they have to add up to equal 180 degrees. So all three of these angles must equal 180. Well, I know that this angle here is 90 degrees, and I just found that angle X is 55 degrees, so I can easily now find angle Y. Well, I know that if I add angle X and 90 degrees together, that's going to give me 145 degrees. And then if I subtract 145 from 180, that lets me know that angle Y would have to equal 35 degrees. So now I know that angle X is 55 degrees and angle Y is 35 degrees. Again, I have another diagram, and I want to use this diagram to help me figure out my missing angle. So as I look at the diagram, I want to try to figure out what kind of angle pairs am I working with. I see this 90-degree angle. That lets me know I've probably got some complementary angles in here. And then I see these two intersecting lines, which lets me know that I actually have some vertical angles in here. And then I see a straight line here, which lets me know I probably have some supplementary angles. So I want to figure out, are there any angle pairs that are going to help me find X? Well, I know in order for me to figure out what X is, I definitely need to figure out this angle right beside it, because I know the two angles have to be 90 degrees. Well, as I look at my picture, I see this 36 degrees, and I know, well, this 36 degrees is across from this angle here, which means they're vertical angles. If they're vertical angles, they are the same measurement. So if this is 36 degrees, that means this angle here is also 36 degrees. Well, if this angle here is 36 degrees, I know that X and this angle have to add up to equal 90 degrees because they're complementary angles. So now that I know this angle here, I can now find X. To find X, I'll simply do 90 minus 36, and that means X has to be equal to 54 degrees. So when you're trying to find the missing angles, you first want to make sure you know your vocabulary. You want to know what the different angle pairs are, and then you want to use those angle pairs to kind of be like a detective, figuring out, using the clues that you have to figure out what the missing angle is.